Good morning, everyone. My name is Sabrina Kilfer, and on behalf of Choice and ACRL, I'd like to welcome you to today's program, Rebuilding Trust in Government and Public Institutions for a Functioning Democracy, which is sponsored by the OECD iLibrary. Today's discussion is one in a series of sponsored webinars from Choice and ACRL that addresses new ideas and developments of interest to the academic library community. Before we get started, I'd like to point out just a few features of the webinar software. All of the attendees who join the presentation are automatically muted and your cameras are off, so no need to worry about generating any noise or feedback. We've got that taken care of for you. In the main area of the screen, you can follow along with the presentation materials. We're using the Q&A feature today. Please use it to ask questions of our presenter. We'll answer as many questions we have time for at the end of the presentation, so please do type your questions into the Q&A module as they occur to you. Also note that there is closed captioning available for today's session. To toggle the automated captions on or off, please use the CC button on the bottom right corner of your screen. Also note that we are recording today's program, and everyone who registered should receive a follow-up email with a link to the archive version. And with that, we are ready to get started, so I'll pass things over to today's moderator, Joanna Gleason.
Thank you, Sabrina, and thank you to Choice and ACRL for hosting us this morning. On behalf of the OECD Washington Centre and OECD iLibrary team, I'd like to welcome all of our attendees today. To those who have attended OECD presentations with Choice and ACRL before, welcome back. And for those who have not joined us before, I'll take this opportunity to introduce the OECD's Washington Centre, where I'm a Public Affairs and Media Officer. We are the OECD's North American office in Washington, DC, and serve as a resource to lawmakers, government agencies, civil society, and academia, connecting them with the work of the OECD and with our expert colleagues themselves. If you are not already aware of us, you may like to save our contact details when you receive the email following today's event, as we're available in the US time zone to respond to data requests, iLibrary subscription inquiries, or any questions related to the work of the OECD. I mentioned the OECD's iLibrary, which is the central knowledge base of OECD expertise, providing access to the latest OECD recommendations, analysis, and data to 2,500 subscribed institutions with over 7 million end users. And I invite you to visit the OECD iLibrary to access books, papers, and statistics related to today's topic and 17 thematic areas of the OECD's work, including governance, economics, education, tax, and more. And with that brief overview of our US team, I'm delighted to welcome Santiago Gonzalez. Santiago is an economist and policy analyst with the Governance Indicators and Performance Evaluation Division of the OECD Public Governance Directorate. He's been the lead analyst of case studies in the determinants of public trust in Korea, Finland, and Norway. Santiago led the creation of question modules on the drivers of institutional trust included in the OECD guidelines on measuring trust, and he was also in charge of the creation of the OECD Trust dataset. So with that, thank you, Santiago, and over to you.
I think you're muted, Santiago.
Okay, here we go. So can you hear me now? Sorry about that.
Yes.
Okay, so thanks a lot to ACRL and Choice for the invitation to this webinar. I am very pleased to be here to present the work that we at the OECD have been doing and that Joanna from the Washington Center already briefly introduced. let me start by saying that this work on public trust is the result of a whole team in the OECD. So I am honored to represent this team today. And we hope that this will be insightful and useful for the work of these communities. So this is the outline of my presentation. I will briefly walk you through the concept of trust and why is this important, why we work on this, what is shown by the existing evidence that we have, the surveys, the indicators that we have, what is that we have been doing at the OECD, and then some concluding remarks, and what is our work agenda on this topic of trust. So basically, when we talk about the trust, we talk about a person's belief that another person or institution will act consistently with his or her expectation of positive behavior. And here I will need to emphasize that our work focuses predominantly on trust in public institutions. Of course, we acknowledge that the interpersonal trust or trust in others is also very important and is related to institutional trust, but our true real focus is on trust in public institutions, and most notably on the trustworthiness of public institutions. But why is this important? I mean, just to enumerate a few reasons. Of course, this is key to the legitimacy of public institutions. This whole notion of the social contract relies on the delegation of power by people to institutions, and this delegation is based on the notion that these institutions could be trustworthy. So therefore, it is at the heart, is core to the functioning of our democracies and our liberal societies. It is also key for people to be able to exercise their political voice, to exercise their political rights. In a society without trust, they will fear to do so. So in a way, it's also a key component of this two-way relationship between public institutions and people. We have seen throughout the COVID pandemic also that in those societies, in those contexts where levels of trust were initially high, there has been more compliance with the regulation sets, with the measures people have been asked to basically take into consideration to cope with the pandemic. And more generally, it's also very useful to the ability of governments to implement policies and to actually move ahead any reform agenda. I mean, where there is trust, of course, we are not asking for blind trust. We are not arguing for blind trust. Citizens should still remain critical, but they should be able to trust their institutions, and this should allow the institutions to actually move forward policies in a non-conflictual way. There is also a new stream of research that is showing that trust or institutional trust contributes in mediating the support for long-term policies that will be key for our democracies in years to come, that are already key, such as global warming or debt sustainability. And as was mentioned by Joanna, just to say that I come within the OECD from the Public Governance Directorate, and as in the Public Governance Directorate, consider and see trust as one of the key outcomes of public administrations. So basically, if public administrations are performing, if they are doing a good work, this should lead to people trusting them. But what is shown by the data on trust? So we have a wide array of indicators on levels of trust. And here I am showing data from the Gallup World Poll that has the largest coverage and has a series since 2006. And what we see is that, well, there is a lot of variation. And here I show 2 data points. So 2007, this was before the global financial crisis, and 2021. And well, several conclusions we can draw from this graph. On average, in OECD countries, less than half of the people report to trust their government. This figure is actually lower for the United States, where it is 40%. But what we also see is that in some countries, those rather to the right, trust has actually decreased over this time period, while in others, it has actually increased, those to the rather to the left. So in a way, we need to be mindful of the context and the specificities in each country, and know that there are variations when it comes to trust indicators. What we do know with a certain level of certainty is that following the 2017, 2008, 2009 global financial crisis, there was a more or less generalized decrease in public trust that was actually coming back to pre-crisis levels just before the COVID. So, but of course the COVID has completely changed the situation again, and I will now refer to this. So this is data that shows what has happened to trust during the COVID emergency, what has been the trend. And what we see here is what is documented in the trust literature as the rallying around the flag effect. Is the fact that when there is a major shock, a major crisis, call it a terrorist attack, call it war, call it now pandemic, people tend to gather behind their institutions. So there are usually spikes on public trust. This is what we have seen for most of the countries. This is data from basically the onset of the pandemic. You see the biggest spike on May 2020, when we were basically, most of us were on a lockdown situation and very uncertain about what all of this was bringing. It is unfortunately, as we are still somehow in the middle of the pandemic, it is not clear what will be the aftermath of this whole situation in terms of trust. So it's still to be monitored. We also know that this crisis has been of a very different nature from the one I talked about before, the global financial crisis. So we don't know with certainty how this will affect the trust levels in years to come. It will pretty much probably also depend as well on what are the recovery strategies followed by countries. But for some countries, as it is the case of the United States, we could see that over the long run and with a lot of volatility, because this tends to be very volatile, we can see that it tends to be somehow of a downward trend in trust levels. And this is data from the Pew Research Center. In 2021, less than a quarter of the American population reports to trust that the government is doing what is right. And here you see also very, clearly the rally around the flag effect that occurred following the 9/11. So there was a spike in trust in 2001, and then it decreased again. So I mean, even though there is volatility, at least in some cases, we see that there are some trends that could be worrisome. And also, I mean, in addition to this, there is also the fact that most metrics of trust that gather a lot of attention refer to trust in the government. But I mean, public institutions are much more wide and cover a lot of additional dimensions. Here I show data that is based on the World Value Survey and the European Value Study for OECD countries, and what we see is that, of course, the trust level varies substantially across institutions. I mean, on average, and of course this differs by country, but you see that trust in the police tend to be the highest. Then usually comes the civil service, then the government, and finally the parliament. So what we see is that institutions that tend to be of a more political nature, if we could call it this way, tend to be least trusted than some others that could be considered more of an administrative nature. So it's also important to keep into account that there are different dimensions of institutions and different trust levels for each of them, and potentially also different drivers for each of these institutions. We also know, because of research we have done at the OECD, that when people answer to surveys, they are able to differentiate between different institutional levels, so-called political administrative institutions, law and order institutions, even private institutions. So there is actually need to look at all this data in a much more nuanced way and in a much more differentiated manner, so that we could actually clarify and have a more accurate diagnosis of what is that we are talking about. So what is that we have done at the OECD? Well, our starting point was that this data was highly aggregated, that it was very hard to interpret. But although we all know and we all acknowledge that this is sending us important signals. I mean, it's a little bit signals of the state of mind of a society when we see distrust indicators. And we started to dig deeper into what was potentially driving behind these numbers, what was behind the signals, the surface of these numbers. And when you start looking at the literature, you find that, of course, there are several streams of research trying to explain trust. Some of them argue that it's very deeply culturally rooted, that it depends a lot on the context, on the specific traits that are passed from generation. Other theories attribute more emphasis to individual traits. However, we look at this from an angle where there is actually a role for their performance and the work of public institutions in actually building, strengthening, restoring this trust level. So when we did all this literature research, we found that there were two main concepts or drivers behind trust in public institutions that we bundle into two broad categories that we could now, we have called competences and values. Competences understood as the ability of governments to deliver services to citizens or to people at the level that they expect. And values, or the adherence to high ethical standards and the extent to which they do it with the transparency, fairness, and accountability. So we broke these 5 divisions further down into 5 policy actionable dimensions, what we call our policy actionable dimensions, that are for, in the case of competences, responsiveness and reliability. And responsiveness, it refers to pretty much the services angle. So the extent to which governments are actually or institutions are actually providing services at the level that people expect, whether they are doing this in an innovative way and meeting what are people's demands and expectations. And within competences, we also have the reliability, and the reliability, it refers to the extent to which governments are minimizing risks and uncertainty. They are taking a forward-looking perspectives, and in a way they are protecting people from future challenges. And then in terms of values, we have 3 dimensions. The first one refers to openness, and openness in terms of transparency, availability of information, disclosure of information, but also in terms of engagement opportunities. Engagement opportunities for people to have their voice heard, to contribute in the design, in the creation of services. So basically to engage with public administration beyond just having access to information. Then very important, integrity. So whether or not people in office or people representing institutions adhere to high ethical standards, whether they are honest, whether they actually behave in the way that people would expect, considering that they are basically representing these institutions and paid with public money. And there is also fairness that refers to the fact that that there is no discrimination, that there is consistent treatment within the society, and that basically everybody, to a certain extent, gets a fair chance and a fair treatment by public institutions. And as I mentioned before, we also acknowledge in our framework that there are other determinants that are individual, that refer to group identity, social traits, preferences, that we also try to measure and interpret when we analyze our trust data that I will explain later what is that we have done. And very important, because this was all, this framework we have reviewed and updated last year. And so we added a new element that refers to the perception of government action to on intergenerational issues and to cope with global challenges, some of which I mentioned before, such as climate change and for instance, well, that sustainability and others. As part of our framework, and kind of linked to what I explained before, we are going beyond just trust in government to include a larger set of institutions. So the local government, the civil service, the parliament, the police, political parties, law and order institutions, and so on and so forth. So we have tried to be much more nuanced and much more comprehensive. And based on this data, we have basically designed a population survey that goes into the drivers of trustworthy institutions. And we do that by trying somehow an innovative measurement approach, because what we are doing is that we are asking respondents about what we call quasi-behavioral situations. It's not simply, do you trust your government, or do you have confidence that your government is doing what is right? It's also putting people into very concrete situations where they are expected to interact with the administration and asking them in kind of relation to this definition that I explained at the beginning, what is the expected behavior that they envisage from this institution? So if there is something affecting your community, will you have the opportunity to have your voice being heard? Or if you apply to a government service, will you be fairly treated? It's much more specific on what is expected from the administration in relation to these 5 dimensions that we have identified as key for building trustworthiness. And we have applied this survey first through country case studies that we, for the moment, have done in 3 countries, 3 OECD member countries, which are Korea, Finland, and Norway. And this is and I will show you a couple of examples of our results based on these case studies. This comes from the Finnish study that we published in May last year. And well, the first element that is important here is that, of course, I talk about the differences in trust across institutions, but there are also the difference across geographies and across socioeconomic groups. What we saw in Finland is that, and this is also something that we are seeing in other countries we are working now, is that there are within societies also trust divides. Here I show for the kind of center-periphery type of relation, so the people in the Helsinki region vis-a-vis more peripheral regions in Norway. And what we found is that the trust from people that tends to be close to the center tends to be higher. These differences are statistically significant. And we also find similar results by income and by education. These divides are worrisome because if they deepen, they have the potential to fracture and to affect social cohesion, and in the long term, I mean, create different type of conflicts and affect the trust. So this is, I mean, this we have been able to see with our survey. We have also been able to look at these drivers in a comparative manner and in a much more targeted manner. So here I show for the 3 countries for which we have done case studies, the percentage of the population that consider governments to be responsive, reliable, open, honest, and fair, based on some of the questions that we ask as part of our survey. And we see that there is important variation across countries, even within components. For instance, if you look at the fairness aspects, you see that in Finland tend to be very high, not so much in Norway and Korea. Likewise, you see reliability in Finland and Norway is quite high, but not so much in Korea. And all of this to say that in different settings, different contexts, there may be different drivers to act upon and different type of action to be implemented to actually work on preserving or restoring public trust. And this is what we do with our in-depth case studies to look at this in greater detail. And this is kind of the things that we are able to see and to analyze with this in-depth research. So this is again shows trust in government, local government, and civil service, again from the Finnish study. And what we see is that, in the case of the government, we see that the element of competence is very important, is the most important, it has the highest relative importance in explaining trust in government. So relative changes on this component will have the higher effect on trust in government. And most notably in this particular case, it refers to the reliability of policies. So the capacity of government to kind of cope with change, be predictable, and be prepared to cope with uncertainty. The picture is different when we look at trust in the local government. We see that here the values component becomes much more important. This is again in the Finnish case. And in particularly, we saw here that it was very important elements of openness and engagement and opportunities for people to get their voice heard and to participate in policy making and in policy decision. And then when we look at trust in the civil service, again, we see a relative importance of the competence component, but in this particular case, a higher relative weight is actually in what relates to service provision and service adaptability. So therefore, I mean, in these three dimensions, we have a different set of actions that we are suggesting for the Finnish administration. So these are just quick examples of the kind of evidence we have generated so far based on our survey implemented in these studies. We are currently working with 2 additional countries in the OECD context. One in the OECD context, sorry, that is New Zealand. And for the first time, we are doing a country outside the OECD kind of, let's say, radio of action, which is Brazil. So, few conclusions. So as I mentioned at the beginning, when we talk about trust, we talk about the function of our democracy. So the kind of erosion of trust, it confirms, when it confirms, is a very worrisome signal, and therefore it calls to actually undertake action to restore it. We see that the picture is not even and is not common across geographies and across different countries. So it requires a more in-depth look into the specificities of each context. We also saw that the existing measures of trust were more actionable. They were hard to interpret. So there is need for better evidence that allow us to discriminate between the institutional and the political level, but also that give us more insight on the drivers and what is behind this trust indicator. And we also see from the few cases that we have conducted that there seems to be a very strong relation between institutional performance and trust in government, but also in other levels of the administration. And this is what I say when I talk about the responsiveness and the reliability as being strong predictors in the cases of Norway, Finland, and Korea. And again, the difference across institutions that I explained when I explained the graph for the Finnish case. So this is a very rich area of study at the moment, and we at the OECD, we also have a very rich program of work on this area in the Public Governance Directorate. We have a very strong mandate from our committee, our kind of overviewing committee at the OECD to work on this. So basically, we are at a point where we have applied our survey in 20 OECD countries. This was done at the end of last year to nationally representative samples. So we will have a lot of additional data that we hope to publish later this year, in the first semester of this year. It will allow us for the first time to have a first set of coherent measures of the, not only on the levels of trust, but on the drivers of trust, and dive much more in the different dimensions that influence trust in different contexts, and also to have a richer analysis by at the country level with the different explanations that could lead trust in different settings. Our questionnaire, as I mentioned, it's of course it has questions that are about perceptions, but it also has questions that are about evaluation and experiences with services. And as I mentioned, that try to go into much more into actual behavior or expected behavior. We will be able to disaggregate all of these measures by different geographies and socioeconomic groups. So we will also have a more nuanced analysis on the different geographies and the different trust on different institutions, but also trust by different groups in those institutions. And as I said, we will have also data on the long-term governance challenges for these 20 countries. So we hope and we are expecting that this will help us to complement and to enrich our analysis substantially. It's a big leap forward for us, the implementation of this survey. The objective in the medium term is that we also generate the time series so that we are able to monitor this over time. Also, so that we are able to see the effects of different actions put forward by countries with the intention of influencing public trust. And we continue with our country case studies that in a way not also go much more deeper into the country setting and are followed by policy recommendations, but also allow us in many occasions to implement and test additional things that could enrich our methodology, additional questions, or look at the issue from a different angle that could also be relevant for other countries. So broadly speaking, this is where we are, what we have done, what we are doing. It's a very, it's an area where there is a lot of things going on. It's a very vibrant academic environment, and at the OECD we are doing a lot on this field. So you will be hearing from us in the near future. Let me conclude by just showing a little bit the resources we have available. Of course, this is a topic where we have been working for many years, and there are many things that you can consult in terms of our measurement strategy. Last year, when we revisited the framework, there was a webinar series, and you could find online the videos of all these webinars. There is a working paper released last year where we revisited our framework and set out what is the new framework, and of course the country reports and information on our framework. So we have this website where you will find out the information. All the information, it is a little bit under construction, but and also our contact email and yes. So I mean, thanks a lot for your attention. I am very happy to take any questions you may have.
Thank you so much, Santiago, for that presentation. And thank you to everybody who has already submitted questions. The chat window for the Q&A remains open, so we continue to invite you to submit your questions. We've received a number regarding the slides and the presentation. So for people who maybe joined us late, I would like to remind everybody that you will receive an email after the event with a link that will lead you to a copy of the recording and a copy of the presentation slides. Santiago, we have a question. I would like to thank Matt. Your presentation referred to key societal trends. Matt wonders what key societal trends refers to in that data.
Yes, so what we are referring to with the key societal trends are, let's say, common challenges we are seeing faced by a number of societies in OECD countries. For example, global warming. For example, the loss of social cohesion. For example, the increasing debt and its sustainability. So these are trends that are common to several countries that are expected to have effects over time. Even intergenerational effects are things that are hardly solved by a single administration and in a single term, so require a long-term policy perspective. So this is a little bit what we are advancing in our measurement strategy in see how we could better capture people assessment of government response to these long-term global challenges. And in many instances are challenges that could not be solved by a country alone. Global warming, I mean, there are bigger and smaller players, but it requires a coordinated and kind of global approach so that there is a solution. And so it is type of things what we are actually advancing in our trust research, and also exploring further the links that that it has when it refers to building a trust. As I said, there is some research showing that support, that trust, the existence of trust, actually supports for policies that tackle this type of challenges. But we hope that with our data set, and once we get all the evidence, we will also advance more evidence and more research on what are the relationships between government action on these subjects and trust in public institutions.
Excellent. Thank you very much. And thank you, Matt, for your question. Now move to Anne's question. Anne asks you to please clarify the difference between civil service and local government as referred to in your presentation.
Yeah, sure. I mean, with the so basically, when we talk about the civil service, we are talking about the people in government and the administration that are not politically appointed. So that are not politically appointed, that are basically, if we could say, that they will not necessarily change government when there is they will not necessarily change position when there is a change of government. So we can talk about this as the bureaucracy, more at the bureaucracy. There are also civil servants at the local level. So a lot of people in service provision in the front line. In some contexts, in many contexts, for instance, teachers or police officers that are in the local context are civil servants. What we mean when we talk about the local government is not so much the government in your capital, so kind of the center of government, if we could call it this way, or the prime minister or president and his cabinet, but more the people working at the local level, in the county that is closer to citizens. So it's and that in many contexts they are responsible for service provision. So in a way, when we talk about local government, we talk about this level, and when we talk about the civil servant, we talk more about the people in charge of providing services, and that are, let's say, a more stable part of the administration, if we could say it this way. I don't know if that was clear, but this is the distinction that we make and what we mean when we talk about these two.
Thank you, Santiago. And another question fairly specifically on the data before I move to some on your presentation more broadly. Teresa asks how generational age played into the data and how age was considered.
So we have age as one of the kind of socioeconomic characteristics that we are looking into our survey. In the cases of Finland and Norway, we have found that there could be some differences in trust by age levels, particularly in what relates to some institutions. But we didn't find that these differences were consistent across all the institutions. So this is one of the questions that we expect to dig deeper with our largest data set that we are expecting to receive or to start working with very shortly, because it's true that we constantly and we hear from many countries that there is a perception that there is a disengagement feeling by the young generations, so that there could also be a trust divide by age. In the cases we didn't find it being so strong. But as I say, these cases are very specific and for very specific context. So we hope to be able to test this further with our data set with the data for the 20 countries that we are expecting.
Thank you. And thank you for that additional information on the definitions and the nature of the data. A slightly broader question, Latif asks whether you believe open government data can enhance trust.
The short answer, yes. So one of the dimensions of our framework is openness. So as I said, openness, of course, it's associated both with the kind of availability of information. And when I talk about availability of information, of course, data is a key asset that now is being produced by government, by public administrations. And I think that in the case of data, and we also have some complementary information on this at the OECD, because we have an index on open government data that is published in Government at a Glance. There is not only the fact that the data is open, but that is useful to people so that they are actually able to manage it and to get access to it, and that is in a format that is friendly and that they could actually put their hands on, and also that there is some guidance, that there could be some guidance by the administration on how to use this data. So there is definitely one of the key assets that administration have at the moment, their data, with a great potential for value creation also by people. And therefore, if it is an asset that is correctly managed and that is put to disposition in the right manner, it will definitely could contribute in building trust between people and the administration. So yes, the answer is yes, and a little bit of an explanation on how.
Excellent, thank you, and thank you for the extra detail. Another question on how programs are implemented. Trust in institutions, to the extent that it is driven by considerations like reliability and responsiveness, has critically important implications for how programs are implemented. And this question asks you to please discuss your research implications from this perspective.
I mean, what I can say about this is that yes, so definitely, in a way, there is a very strong component on the implementation of policies. Just to give you, for example, the case of Norway, one of the things we were discussing with them, and that is one of the important findings of this research, is that it's very important to consider the experience at the front line of service provision, because there is where the interaction between people and institutions takes place, but also where a lot of the potential innovation is developed. And sometimes, because of the ways administration works, where there are many barriers, or there could be barriers, it is not possible to scale up all of this, or to scale up and to use all this knowledge. So in a way, let's say there could be a lot of insights from the implementation of policies that could be essential for trust building. And then there is a lot of richness of information that could be gathered from people that is at the front line of service provision. So this is, and this, I would say much more in the responsiveness field, because this is where we actually are talking about the service provision. The reliability is more about the, let's say, it's more about the policy setting and the protection by from governments to people. So on this one, it may be harder to involve and to have this dialogue with people, but the responsiveness, certainly there is a big potential, and the implementation of policies, of changes, not only should be an objective of trust building, but could also feed back into the whole strategy for preserving trust.
Thank you, Santiago, and to the participants who continue to send through their questions. Thank you. A question from Kenneth is about participation, and he asks whether you have data on how to involve more people in the institutions that serve them, and whether it's fair to assume that more people being involved leads to greater trust.
So I mean, in a way, we are asking some of these questions about possibilities to be involved, and if people consider that their voice is being heard, or that they actually participate, that their voice will be heard. There is also a stream of work in the Public Governance Directorate that deals with deliberative democracy and let's say people involvement in different type of decisions in a very direct manner. So this is also a resource that we could make available, because they have a data set of cases where they discuss many examples of this type of deliberative involvement. What I would say is that it's not only I think that the number, I mean, yes, there should be opportunities for being involved. Not so much the number, but to me, what is very important is that people receive feedback on their involvement, that the decisions that are taken are explained then to them, so that they feel that their involvement, their engagement was meaningful. What is a very bad, let's say, outcome, or a very bad scenario is when people participate, but the government then do not take this into account. So more than the number, I would say that is the quality of the engagement, the feedback provided, and the fact that it's considered into the actual policy design or the actual decision that is taken, what is important. I mean, it's not always possible to keep everyone happy, and people have different interests, but at least you have much more chance of building trust if you at least explain the reasons that led to a certain decision, and the process that was followed to reach such a decision, and how you treated the input that you received from people who were involved. So these are steps that are important for trust building.
Thank you very much, and an interesting one for us to all consider as participants in our own societies. I'd like to thank Jennifer for her question. She asks whether any governments or institutions have been able to make this trust information, I believe as presented in your presentation, actionable. And is there an example of where this information has guided a government or institution toward positive change?
I'm not sure I understand the question, but what comes to mind is the following. I mean, we have seen from the case studies we have conducted in Norway and in Finland that communication is also important for trust building. And we have seen a lot of this during the pandemic. These countries have had a very open communication strategy based on facts, have been able to acknowledge when they don't know, there is uncertainty. They haven't hidden, they haven't hide information from people, and this has proven successful in their strategy to cope with the COVID. We also constantly heard, and there is also a stream of work in the OECD working on the public governance on government communication, but we are constantly confronted with this fact, basically, or that this notion that misinformation and disinformation could lead to distrust, or and that this is something that, of course, with social media and the availability of channels, it's very hard for people to disentangle what is correct, what is right, and what is wrong. So there is definitely a link of communication and how to treat this type of let's say, fake news or disinformation and the effects that it could have on trust. There are ways that governments could work around this through their official communication channels, by making them more effective, by making them more transparent, by issuing guidelines on how governments should communicate and what public servants should and should not be doing to avoid that the spread of this misinformation and disinformation. But it's definitely a critical challenge because it's a very complex landscape where many actors could act in many unpredictable ways. So, but one of the big questions, and we also heard in our case studies that there was, for instance, an increase in the hate speech towards public agents and public officials that was also causing them to be more fearful and more kind of less willing to actually take action or implement certain types of policies. So it has many implications on several directions. So it's a very complex issue.
Thank you very much. I now have a longish question, and I regret I have to ask for a brief answer to a long question, but it relates to the OECD drivers of trust framework, which emphasize perceptions of intent, values, responsiveness, and behavior. But this question asks, what about the quality of life conditions that government actions, programs, products, and services might affect?
So I mean, in a way, I think this is very much linked to our framework, because in a way, what we are saying is that there is a direct link of trust or trustworthiness of public institutions with the quality of services and the quality of policies. So in a way, we recognize this and we try to measure this, of course, with the limitations that a single module or a single questionnaire allows. This is so we, in terms of services and the quality of services, I think it is there. It is also true that there is literature showing that economic conditions and economic insecurity could also have an effect on trust, basically. That of course, when the economy is looking more gloomy, or when people personal situation is not very positive, and in terms of their economic security, this could affect their trust in public institutions. There is some research showing that this is also the case. We have also included a question on economic insecurity in our questionnaire that we hope will also give us some lights about these results, will allow us to substantiate and to further elaborate on these results. However, as I showed at the beginning, because there was this series of trust in the US that is also could be associated with the economic cycle and improve or decrease in some of the living conditions at certain points. But what you also see is that there is a trend that is somehow downwards over the long run, even with these cycles. So even though these economic factors are important, we also know that they are not the only ones, and that it could be even less important than those that are related to actually the performance and the work of public institutions. But yes, they definitely play a role.
Thank you so much. And given our time is running out, we'll finish on what I think is a bonus question from the questioner. I wonder if you can tell us in just a couple of sentences what libraries and librarians can do to help rebuild trust in government and institutions.
That's a very...
It's a specific question for our specific audience, but I thought you might have one thought to leave us on.
I mean, I feel that, the key role is guiding people towards trusted sources, kind of scientific resources. Of course, people is free to consult whatever they want, but sometimes they ask and they have questions, and the more you can guide them to information that is fact-based, that is that comes from a reliable source, that is substantiated, that allow them to think critically, and that they contribute in building this critical citizenry, if I could say this way, because as I say, it's not about blind trust. I mean, in Western democracies, it's not about building blind trust. It's about creating critical citizens that will trust institutions when they are trustworthy, when they deserve to be trustworthy. And for this, and we also have seen that there is a relation between what we call, we could say, civic education and trust. So the more there is people, the more people is engaged, willing to be a good citizens, to comply with norms, to be involved in current events in a critical way. And this is somewhere where I think librarians could somehow help guiding people in this direction. So this would be my answer to this, which is the first time I get this question. So I hope it was perspective.
Well, thank you very much for that answer for our audience of many librarians here with us today. So with that, on behalf of the OECD and the OECD iLibrary, I would like to thank you so much, Santiago, for your presentation, and to the participants for their questions. I will hand back to you, Sabrina.
Great, thanks. This is Sabrina from Choice and ACRL. Like Joanna said, thanks so much to Santiago for taking the time to present for us today, and Joanna for moderating. And thanks to our attendees for your questions and comments. If you're interested in finding out more about the OECD iLibrary and how it will benefit your research team, please reach out to Ian Williamson. I'll drop his email in the chat. Ian.williamson@oecd.org. Ian's contact information will also be provided in the follow-up email. I'd like to remind our viewers that we did record today's program, so be on the lookout for a follow-up email from Choice and ACRL with a link to the recording. Also, if you have a few minutes after the presentation to fill out a brief survey, we really appreciate it. Your responses help us improve our presentations. So thanks again to all of you out there for joining us. We hope you learned something from the session, and we hope to see you again in the near future on another webinar.